Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion video where we're talking about different goals that people have reached and new heights that players have achieved in the 3.11 Harvest League. For those of you who are new to the channel, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. And if at any point in time you'd like more information about any of our discussion points today, there are of course some links down below in the video description for your convenience. So we asked the question of our YouTube community. All the fans of Harvest Crafting are mentioning how it allows players to reach new heights. What new heights, in other words, what new in-game goals have you reached this league that were previously unreachable for you? Now there's a whole bunch of questions here and a whole bunch of comments in response. We're not going to be able to get to all of these, but before we even jump into any of them, I wanted to give us some language together as a community talking about Harvest. I've tried my best over the last couple of weeks with a new baby and a wife and 3 other kids running around to try to stay up to date with some of the discussions surrounding Harvest. And I feel like players are missing some lingo, or maybe there are some words that we could be using that would help augment our discussions about Harvest League in a more improved fashion. As you can see, having a new kid has not improved my Photoshop skills. I'm still using Paint, and as a boomer, that's okay by me. So, some of the language I think that can help us in these discussions about Harvest is talking about gaps in terms of wealth or gear gaps, and then ceilings in terms of the top level of player power or power creep is oftentimes what's referred to, and then a floor. I think oftentimes we need to have some language that talks about the ceiling or the top end of player power, something that is new, something that is added to the game that previously wasn't in the game. An example of this from 3.10 Delirium League would of course been all of the various cluster jewels that were added to the game. They were something that were previously not included in Path of Exile and introduced a new ceiling for a whole lot of different builds and a whole lot of new player power introduced in 3.10. This brings us to the floor. A lot of players haven't necessarily been able to get to those ceilings. They're not able to necessarily take on the top content. They're not necessarily able to farm enough currency in order to craft those top end jewels, again, using an example from Delirium. And so therefore the floor is where most players are at. The floor is not where the worst players are at. I need to make that very, very clear for our discussion today. The floor is not an indicator that you are a bad player at Path of Exile. A lot of people think of it that way, but that is not what that means. The floor simply means where most players are at. The ceiling is where the fewest players are at. It's where the top of the most top richest players are at. And that is where there's the furthest and the most expensive chase goals and chase gear in the game are. And so of course there's going to be the fewest players who are able to actually reach those heights. The ceiling and the floor are not necessarily meant in any game to be representative of equal population portions of the player base. In other words, you don't want to have 50% of your player base at the ceiling and 50% of your player base at the floor. That's probably not going to be good for player retention or for new player acquisition. It's not going to be good for either of those things. That's a discussion for another day, but just take that at face value for our discussion today. Now we've got our ceiling, we've got our floor, and then we've got this big gap in between. That big gap is what a lot of players complain about. Frankly, it's a big reason why a lot of you guys hang out and chat in our Discord or watch our videos on economics. It's because players are looking to learn about that gap and move in between the floor to the ceiling. Again, the floor doesn't necessarily mean that you're at your worst state, but rather your floor simply means that you're not at the ceiling. Depending on where you are in your climb and in your gear progression, you are somewhere along that spectrum of moving from the floor through the big gap to the ceiling of wherever it is that you're aiming for that particular build in that particular league. It is my thesis and my contention that Harvest did not add to the ceiling of player power. It didn't add a new ceiling. In other words, Delirium introduced new player power, let's say, using that example again, cluster jewels, and Harvest did not necessarily add something new else on top of that with some new tier of crafting or a new item to craft on or a new way to acquire more passive points or a more efficient way to acquire the same amount of passive points but with less stuff. Those are all examples of increasing player power. Typically, player power increases when new things are added to the game. For instance, the various new types of exalted orbs that were added with this newest expansion, Conquerors of the Atlas. All of those new types of exalted orbs add player power because it allows us to target craft more stuff and to target craft some mods that previously did not exist. Those new mods represent a new ceiling for players to aim for. Harvest didn't add something to that. What Harvest has done is it has added access to better gear for a wider number of players. So in other words, Harvest did allow more players to access the ceiling. So rather than saying it raised the roof or raised the ceiling, we now essentially have raised the floor and brought it closer to the ceiling. This is what I believe Path of Exile Harvest has done. It has essentially distorted or warped Path of Exile. Path of Exile is a ceiling and a floor in a room. It's brought it all together. It's smushed it together. It has brought the ceiling relatively the same to where it had been prior to Harvest. There's not necessarily new player power available, but it's raised the floor in comparison to where the ceiling is, making the gap much, much smaller in between where your character would have been normally at its floor position to where it can be at its ceiling position. Another way to summarize this with some helpful language is to say that what Harvest did is it added player access to very, very powerful crafts already in the game, but not necessarily accessible or easily accessible for most players. Harvest crafting has added a new level of access for players, but it has not necessarily added a new level of power to the top end of Path of Exile power creep. So a lot of players feel like they've got characters that are more powerful than ever. And that's true because the floor has essentially been raised. Again, the floor does not mean that your character is at its worst state or you're the worst player in Path of Exile. It simply means this is where most players' power level is at for their characters in relationship with the total amount of power that is available in game. And that's, of course, the ceiling. Path of Exile has brought up the floor and kept the ceiling where it is. So rather than chanting something from the 90s about raising the roof, we ought to talk about how Harvest has really raised the floor. All right, so now we have some language about ceilings and floors and big gaps. We can dive into some of the goals and some of the achievements that many of you as a community have hit. So Jacob Baggs starts us off and he says, "Hey, I got my first headhunter." That's great, Jacob. If you have never had a headhunter and this is your first league playing with a headhunter, this is an incredibly fun league to play with a headhunter, namely because, of course, you can apply delirium orbs. Now that we've gotten delirium orbs in the game, you can target farm whatever sorts of content you want with scarabs, but then you can also add on delirium orbs on top of it. There's just oodles and oodles of rare monsters for you to kill and steal their various buffs. And so a headhunter is probably more fun now than ever. So Jacob, congratulations on your first headhunter. Ishmael says, killing Shaper and Cirrus for the first time. Congrats to you as well. This is fantastic news. I remember the first time I ever took down Shaper, it was like a goosebumps moment, right? Like hair was standing up. The little amount of hair that I have on my arms was standing up. I had sweat beads running down my balding forehead and various other awkward body functions going on. I mean, it was fantastic, right? You know that nervous feeling that when you meet the girl of your dreams in your stomach, what that's like? Well, it wasn't quite like that, but it was something similar in killing Shaper for the first time. And Cirrus, I gotta say, the first Cirrus kill, at least for me, was more of like a relief. Like Shaper for me was a several league buildup, whereas Cirrus was like, oh man, that guy was really frustrating. I'm glad that's over and I finally overcome the challenge. Anyway, congratulations to you, Ishmael, for killing Shaper and Cirrus for the first time. Chops to Chapo gives us this piece of discussion fodder. He says, "I think the biggest thing that needs to happen is people relearn the meaning of mirror tier." I completely agree with that. I think too many people are throwing out that word and saying, oh, look at this mirror tier thing that I crafted. That it might be incredibly strong. It might be very, very good, especially in relationship to what we used to be able to craft. But there is a tier unto itself that is worthy of mirrors. He continues, "I will put it in perspective with literally any other game on the market. In Harvest, it is incredibly easy to craft good armor pieces, given you have the time and patience to hit good rolls. In a situation where you train these skills, the more time and effort you put into working on your cold resist, theoretically, you would be more resistant to cold, so that makes sense. Weapons are incredibly hard to make with Harvest, and in terms of other games, it is usually the weapon that is legendary and super OP that makes us a god. So, in my mind, good weapons being mirror tier is a good thing. Too long, didn't read. Armor should be craftable. Weapons should be the only thing worth mirroring in the game. Now, Chops, I think I'm going with you in the spirit of your post, but maybe not in the letter of your post. In general, armor is not necessarily the legendary thing that people remember of in mythology or in stories. It's oftentimes a weapon piece. I think mithril armor, like Bilbo Baggins and Frodo Baggins, would have a little bit of a disagreement there. I believe the Wheel of Time series has got several different pieces of armor that are legendary. There's a lot of different mythoses around different pieces of armor, but nonetheless, I get what the spirit is that you're saying. And weapons in Path of Exile are still incredibly tough to craft, and there still are mirror tier weapons on the market that exist inside Harvest League. Harvest League and Harvest Crafting haven't killed mirror markets and haven't killed mirror tier items. They may have rearranged and reoriented things, but every single league that happens, it's very possible that more players now than ever are actually looking at mirror tier items and saying, okay, what's the difference between that mirror tier item and my item? Again, not because the ceiling has been raised, but because the floor has been raised. And so now more players are looking at the ceiling and going, wow, that's really not too far away from where I'm at. Or rather, the power increase for the price that I'm going to have to pay really isn't that big, and so I might as well just stay where I'm at. And oftentimes, that is true in Path of Exile. The stronger and stronger your character gets, the more diminishing returns you get on increased player power. Oftentimes, mirror tier gear and the difference between truly mirror tier gear and something that's simply very, very expensive, but not quite mirror tier, is a few percentage points of damage or survivability. It's often very minuscule, but nonetheless, those differences are what makes something very, very expensive and pushes it into the mirror tier category because it is perfect for that particular slot for a specific build. Barrett Anderson says, making gear I normally couldn't without having to spam dozens, no, hundreds of chaos. This is the future of PoE. Find craft, farm craft, make gear, and win. Barrett, I think you're right. I think this entire whole system that they have put out with Harvest, not necessarily the garden in and of itself. The garden has gotten plenty of negative feedback over the course of Harvest League, and a lot of players are saying, hey, let us keep the targeting crafting, but please get rid of the garden. I think GGG will hopefully take that to heart and will move forward, but I do really feel like this is where they're aiming for moving forward. We've already heard from ExileCon that certain types of currency like fusings are going the way of the dodo bird. They're on the way out, and so I think it's probably plausible for us to say that targeting deterministic crafting is probably the way how we are going to envision most crafting moving forward. It might not happen right away. It might take a few leagues for grinding gear games to figure out exactly what the power level is for players as they access these various levels of crafts, but I think this is where the game is headed. LOL Immune says, honestly, it's added nothing to any league where trading is allowed, but SSF characters can actually get decent rares. This is a great, great point, and I feel like this needs to be underlined, highlighted, etc. So we ran a private league for the G3 community over the course of Harvest League. I've also played in the main Harvest League, but also in this private league, and I feel like private leagues are kind of like a hybrid between trade and SSF. There are other players who are also finding stuff alongside with you, and you can trade with them, but because the player population is so much smaller, it's much more akin to SSF. It's not true SSF because you can trade with other players, but it's a much more shortened experience, or rather focused experience, where you are much more emphasizing what you find and what you craft rather than emphasizing making currency to trade like in true Trade League. And this, I think, is one of the highlights, it's one of the gold stars, it's one of the 2 thumbs up aspects of Harvest League, is that Harvest League has allowed for players to find, craft, create their own gear, and then tell stories about it. Oh, how did you get that piece of jewelry? Oh, how did you make that armor? Oh, what sort of weapons are you using with that particular build that you are playing on? These stories that players now have about their items are something that were previously only available to those players who were aiming for the ceiling, where they could tell a long story of all of the chaos and all of the exalted and all of the annulments and all of the divines that they threw at an item before they finally said, yes, I'm happy with this item, or no, I'm not happy with it and I'm just getting rid of it. Harvest crafting and Harvest as a league has been a wild success as adding player stories and adding player investment into their own gear. Players no longer have to feel like they must trade. Players can now feel like they can truly craft their own character from scratch regardless of their skill level. And I think that is a massive, massive win, especially when so many players complain about trade in Path of Exile. If you truly don't want to trade in Path of Exile, you don't have to in order to get yourself some of the best gear available in the game. Rud says, I would love for Harvest to go core for the campaign only, not for maps, because it makes leveling more fun. First time I am proudly using endgame gear I crafted myself. I don't see that happening again. Most important, I now understand crafting a lot better. Rud, this is a great point, and again, this is, I think, another gold star for Harvest. This is an example of what Harvest does really, really well. It helps you smooth out your leveling process on any new character. I have heard the least amount of complaints this league during Harvest about players creating new characters and having to level them. Now, you can take that in a couple of different ways. You could take that in one way and be a cynic and say, well, the reason, Iron, why no one's complaining about leveling new characters is because no one's playing Harvest anymore. Haha, got him. So you could say that. Another way that you could say it is players are leveling new characters and they don't mind it because they've got their gardens available to them and they can simply craft whatever gear it is that's necessary for them to level up and to speed through the campaign. Regardless of which side of that coin you fall down on, the reality is that Harvest has added a new level of access for players to craft as they progress a character, and that even continues into the end game in maps. Now, I'm with Rud in that it would be interesting to see if this amount of crafting was allowed early on still in the campaign. And I think we've got some hint as to some of the thought process going on at Grinding Gear Games regarding this. Because remember, when Harvest was first released, the intention was for those big-time powerful crafts to be available earlier on, like Exalts or Targeted Annuls. The goal was originally to have those big-time rare crafts not show up in endgame, but show up earlier as you were going and progressing through the 10x story campaign. The idea being to help smooth out your leveling and get you to the end game. That was the idea. So in terms of your idea, Rud, about seeing it in the campaign and restricted there, that would be interesting. It's certainly something that could happen, and I think at least in some ways, GGG tried that with Harvest when it was released. The backlash, of course, around that is that it feels really, really good to find those rare things as you're leveling, and then it feels really, really bad not to find them anymore. And that's, of course, why GGG has implemented so many changes during Harvest League to allow players to actually craft the awesome endgame stuff that they've got, like the stuff that you've crafted. Skylar says, this is my second league and I'm about to push Shaper soon and can handle red maps. That is a great, great success story about Harvest. There are so many players who started in Metamorph, and we would get comments here on the channel. We would get comments on Discord. I even got a couple of emails from people just struggling with the game because of the amount of monster life and monster power that was added during Metamorph League. And a lot of players saw Shaper and saw Cirrus and even saw Conquerors themselves as something that was far off and unconquerable. It is a massive, massive success for Grinding Gear Games player retention and for new player acquisition and pushing on into that retention category if new players are able to achieve heights that other players maybe would have gotten frustrated at and simply left the game. This is really, really good news. And I feel like for several years, I and other community members have taken a dump on GGG when it comes to tutorials and hand-holding new players, right? Frankly, this is why a lot of YouTube channels exist even, and why a lot of community discussion exists, is because Grinding Gear Games doesn't necessarily offer the greatest hand-holding experience, and so a lot of players want to help each other out as a community and say, hey, here's a smarter or a better or a more efficient way to do this, to learn about the game. That's why a lot of us are around to chat Path of Exile. This right here, I think, is a great success story from Skylar. If it's your second league and you can already learn about the game and progress and push endgame bosses like Shaper, some of you out there are going to be going, oh, Iron, Shaper is really not even like an endgame boss anymore, man. Yes, he is. Shaper is still an endgame boss. He's going to be an endgame boss for a long, long time, at least up until Path of Exile 2 or 4.0. Shaper is still considered an endgame boss. So congratulations, Skylar. Don't let any of the naysayers hate on you. You have achieved so much in your second league, what many other players who have been playing this game for far longer haven't yet achieved. So congratulations to you. And again, kudos to Harvest Crafting for allowing you to do that. Spencer says, I reached the same heights, but with much cooler gear. Haha, finally did a low life build too. This is another great example, again, reiterating, and I hope we can, at least from Harvest and from this discussion today, take some of this lingo. If you guys have got better suggestions for lingo and for language talking about player power and player access, I welcome you to make comments down below. I personally feel like ceiling and floor are relatively well-known concepts, and so I feel like applying them to Harvest is a great way to start the discussion as we talk about that gap in player power between those who are the wealthiest and the most geared out, the most min-maxed characters and players in Path of Exile, and the rest of us, the average exile. So for those of you who have reached the same heights but with cooler gear, this is again a great example of the floor being raised due to Harvest. A lot of players who are on that ceiling side of the gap, again, they're not necessarily min-maxed players, they're just along that gap somewhere and they're aiming towards the ceiling more than they are towards the floor. Those players oftentimes have looked at Harvest and left comments, whether that's on our channel or on the forums or on Discord or on Reddit, and simply said, hey, we're not inspired, we're not that happy with Harvest. Because again, Harvest did not add necessarily a new ceiling. There are a couple of new things here and there, like, you know, you can get that synthesis craft that's now available on stuff. And in some ways that's new, but in other ways it's not, right? Because synthesis legacy items are still available in standard. So in some ways it's kind of new, but in other ways it's not. Anyway, I think this language is going to be helpful for us as we talk about Harvest moving forward into the future as a league. It was a league that has raised the floor for many and has allowed more players to reach a new ceiling that they never previously before could have dreamed of, and now has a lot more players looking at mirror tier items and asking, what is the difference between a mirror tier item and the gear that I currently have? And what should I be aspiring to next? I think it's shrunk the gap between the ceiling and the floor. Well, thanks so much for watching today's discussion. If there's anything that I've said today that you agree with or disagree with, or you just have got another comment on something entirely different, I'd love to read that down below. Feel free to drop us a comment, say hello, and once again, thanks so much for watching, and I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.